I'd like to start podcast 2 of Chapter 4, Task Presentation. How teachers choose to communicate with students is very important. That communication depends on the characteristics of the learners or the students, and also it depends on the type of content that you are trying to teach the students. Verbal communication is very important for teachers, and usually that's sufficient as far as directions and skill content is concerned if the students already have prior knowledge or prior experience with that particular activity. But instead, if there is a beginning skill level, then you need to couple verbal communication with a demonstration. An important part about verbal communication in physical education is that to teach the academic language of physical education to the students. In fact, we think that's so important now because it's related to literacy. We think it's important enough to put an actual cognitive objective and require that on our lesson plans in physical education. Teachers generally assume students understand what they've taught them or the directions that they've given them after being told 1 to 2 times or not being told at all. The students already know that, a lot of the beginning teachers think. But you can't assume that students understand or know something because you know a lot about that particular activity. You've got to make sure that you start at square one and that everyone is on the same page. A demonstration is given along with verbal instructions to teach a skill or a tactic or a strategy or whatever it is that you're trying to teach at the time, because it gives the learner two sources of information. Demonstrations, more than anything, need to be accurate. The students will attempt to reproduce the movement that they see. They will mimic what they see you do. A teacher's tendency is to only show a partial part of the task or a partial skill, or show the skill out of context. That's very important not to do. You need to always show the whole task or skill and show it in the context that it's going to be used in a game or in a dance or in gymnastics or whatever other type of content you're using. Students need to see the whole action, and they need to see it at the correct speed and in the skill environment. It's also important to get students to demonstrate skills. In that way, teachers can focus the other students' view or what they see in, or their focus, what they see in the skill demonstration. It's also good to use students to demonstrate if a teacher can't demonstrate it themselves. It's also important to demonstrate the organizational format that's required for the practice task. In other words, the context of the skill and how it's going to be used. You demonstrate both the skill and the context, and particularly when there is a complex skill that needs to be used in a particular environment. When teaching content that's related to being creative or something that is a problem-solving activity, sometimes teachers don't like to demonstrate tasks in that particular teaching strategy because they think it takes away from the spontaneity of or the creativity of the students. But you do need to demonstrate the type of response that you're looking for and the concept that you are trying to focus on. It's also important during the demonstration to emphasize important task information or skill information. Why is it that the skill is performed? What in the offensive part of the game or the defensive part of the game, what is it, how does that relate to the skill that you're trying to teach them? Also, the rules that are involved with that particular skill and the movement principles or the biomechanics of that skill and why that's important. The critical elements of the skill, again, 1 to 3 only, and that's it. But these critical elements, the reason they're called critical elements are that they are the 1 to 2 to three different types of things about that skill that are critical to the success of the skill. Other parts of the skill probably could be not be covered. And by not covering them, that means that they are not critical to the success of the skill. Another thing you can do during a demonstration is freeze the action to show particular positions of body parts when you're trying to perform the skill. And again, it's important to check for student understanding, to ask them if they understand what they're practicing and understand the directions. Using media materials, which for us would be things like iPads, can have their advantages because they can be motivational for the students. When they see a whole skill performed in the Olympics, then they can see and relate to how important it is for them to be learning to do that skill in an efficient way. It can give the students a perspective on where and what they are doing and how it fits into a larger whole, in other words. Also, good models provided are usually really the models provided in these demonstration media materials are usually good ones. For instance, going to UberSense and trying to find a film or a video clip on a tennis serve, and showing a student what that tennis serve is supposed to look like as a whole. And it usually frees the teacher to do other things. Disadvantages are that sometimes you'll find things, particularly on the iPad apps, that may not be at the appropriate level for students. Sometimes it's too much information for them to understand. And also sometimes things can go wrong with technology like iPads if there's not an internet connection in that school or whatever, or if it goes down as they often do, then it's not possible to get those films, particularly from the apps. Selecting learning cues is so important to teaching and physical education that I've got 4 slides at the end of this podcast here about selecting learning cues. Good teaching and learning cues are accurate. In other words, you need to use resources or references to find what the critical skills are, or critical elements are of skills. Again, here's a quote from Dr. Judy Rink at the University of South Carolina, or she's retired from there now. More effective teachers use reference materials to correctly identify what is important in the skill being taught. Using books, using internet references, and citing them at the end of a lesson plan, I cannot say any more so than I've already said. It is crucial to teaching. The learning cues also need to be brief and critical to the skill, as I said before, 1 to 3 cues. Learners cannot attend to lots of words and to a lot of information at one time. The cues that you choose need to be critical to the performance, and they focus the learner on the intent of the skill. Good teaching and learning cues are also appropriate for the skill level and the age. Sometimes at the beginning level, you can use what we call environmental design, or designing the environment of a task to elicit the movement. In other words, if you're asking them to throw the ball high on an overhead throw in softball and they're throwing against the wall, you could put a piece of tape 10 feet above the court and try to get them to throw the ball as hard as they can above that piece of tape. And in that way, you don't even have to go over the critical skills. They'll do that, a good lead with the elbow and a step forward in opposition usually, and weight transfer. They'll do those things, those cues, without even thinking about them or having them focused. For an advanced learner, you need to be more selective about choosing the learning cues. They need to be ordered by importance, and one thing that beginning teachers do a lot, and actually so do experienced teachers, we try to correct everything all at the same time. Go through every single skill cue that there is, and we try to do everything at one time. They can't handle it. We've got to be able to narrow it down to 1 or 2 things that we try to help them by correcting their skills or making them more efficient. Younger students have less experience and they have fewer verbal skills, so a lot of times it's easier to let them mimic the skills with the whole action first and with a few cues to guide their performance. Older students, unfortunately, a lot of past practice that they've had in physical education may be incorrect or inefficient, and they have had a lack of success in the past that makes them a bit unmotivated. But again, using fewer cues with appropriate language for them, you can break those old habits that they have. Good teaching and learning cues are also appropriate for different content. For closed skills, you need to sequence the skills and provide visual pictures of critical elements, and usually we use things in a sequence: hand, hand, foot, foot, like a cartwheel. For open skills, you have to first sometimes teach it as a closed skill to reduce the complexity of the environment, but then and use closed skill cues, but open cues need to be focused on adjusting the response. We call those perceptual cues. In other words, an example is lead the receiver with the ball in football or basketball. Movement concepts are usually done at the elementary level, and we attach limitations to students' choices. And finally, good teaching cues are more effective if they're organized and practiced. Cues should be organized in a sequence and practiced in the order the cues will be performed. That's what we call summary cues. They highlight significant aspects of movement, they sequence the actions for the performer, and they serve as observation cues for the teacher. That's another good thing about summary cues. An example is the push away, downswing, backswing, release of the swing in bowling. That's the end of podcast 2 for Chapter 4.